Technical delays. I think we have a record number of computers up here that we've had. Welcome to the annual Ihde lecture. Don Ihde was a distinguished professor of philosophy at Stony Brook. He was one of the co-founders of the department. He was the founder of a movement called Postphenomenology, which our speaker will tell us about, and written numerous books that are in the library over there. And he thankfully endowed an annual lecture in his name. And the lecturer today, Robert Rosenberger, was one of his students. Robert is an associate professor in the School of Public Policy.
That's right.
At Georgia Tech. I would say he's one of the leading philosophers of technology in the country, and he's also a pioneer of. He also carries forward postphenomenology, and his latest. Some of you may have seen his book Callous Objects, which is really wonderful, great to assign for students, but also his latest book, which came out this week.
Just this weekend.
Is The Critical Ihde, which is sort of the greatest hits of Don Ihde. His best pitches, so to speak. So anyway, we owe him a great deal of appreciation for that. So Robert, welcome to Robert Rosenberger.
Thank you, Bob. That was really nice. Thanks for having me here. It's neat to be here doing this. So I wanted to talk today. I want to take this opportunity to talk about this term postphenomenology and what it means, what we're up to when we're using this idea. So what is postphenomenology? I would say it was more than 10 years ago. A group of us were at 4S, which is the Society for Social Studies of Science, right? The big STS conference where a lot of philosophers of technology go. And a group of us were in Buenos Aires for that conference, and we were sitting around at this table. We were considering starting a book series. We were doing some postphenomenology panels. We had been doing some postphenomenology panels for a few years, and we decided if we're going to do this book series, then we're going to be stuck with this name. We're going to be stuck with the name postphenomenology if we don't do something about this, because it's a terrible name and we all hate it. And what are we going to do? What's a better name? Don Ihde was there. In the middle of this conversation, Peter Paul Verbeek, the Dutch philosopher of design, Danish anthropologist of education, Catherine Hasse was there, a couple more of us, right? Like, all right, we're gonna do this. If we start a book series with the term postphenomenology in it, like that will settle it. We've done a bunch of panels on this, any ideas? And it was just crickets, right? We couldn't think of a better term. But we don't like the term because it's not it's not anti-phenomenology, right? Postphenomenology is not against phenomenology, or it's not even it's certainly not the opposite of it or something like that. And it's also a big, long, ugly word. Don had used it as a title of a book back in 1993. It's just a collection of his works. And even in that book, it starts off with like, hey, everybody's calling things post these days, so I'm gonna call my book post. It was like real casual. He wasn't like, I have but we were doing something distinctive, right? We were doing this phenomenology of technology based on, like, building off of Don's work. It has this sort of situated post-human commitment to it that connects us with some other figures like Donna Haraway. There's this connection to American pragmatism, right? So there's this work that we think that we're doing that's distinctive. Couldn't come up with a better name, and here I am, whatever it is, 10 or 15 years later, talking about the evolution of postphenomenology as a school of thought. So we're just kind of stuck with it as a term, but as a school of thought, it's pretty cool. What I'd like to do today is introduce you to the main ideas. Some of them will be already familiar to a bunch of you, but I'll kind of go through those quickly, and talk about what some of the new ideas coming out of postphenomenology as a school, what are they? How could they be useful to your own work is one of the things that I'm imagining. If you're analyzing technology, if you're thinking about technology, how might these ideas be useful? So Don, in the book that Bob was just pitching, right, this just came out the other day. It's sort of a best of Don Ihde's work. SUNY Press approached me with the idea. It was Lenore Langsdorff who recommended me to be the editor. She's a former Ihde Alumni Award winner as well. Anyway, Don says, what the philosopher is doing, if you will, is not doing foundational philosophy, but is doing a kind of critical reflection upon what has happened to our episteme, our perception of the time, right? This is back from the middle of the 80s when Don was explicitly trying to integrate ideas, especially from Richard Rorty's version of American pragmatism, into phenomenology. And he's trying to say, look, this is the move. We want to do a phenomenology that is practically oriented, right? That's based on our problems rather than something that's foundational, right? The sort of anti-foundationalism of American pragmatism is one of the, I think, key parts, although I think still a controversial part of what makes post-phenomenology what the post is even referring to. That book series I was talking about does happen. The two kickoff books, where this one edited by Bob, Technoscience and Postphenomenology, which builds off of the, it was actually Don Ihde's retirement conference. People like Kyle White and Evan Selinger are in there, also former Ihde Alumni Award winners. And then also this companion book, Postphenomenological Investigations, that Peter Paul Verbeek and I co-edited. And we have some like critical respondents in there, like Andrew Feenberg and Diane Michael-Felder and Albert Borgman, trying to bring together, like, what is post-phenomenology about? What are its, like, test its limits? How do we apply these things? And, you fast forward to now, and there's a stack of books that we've done. A handful of them have this post-phenomenology and X structure in the title, but we wanted to be able to create a venue where graduate students could be publishing these ideas and build on these things. I think, we're often, graduate students will co-edit books for the series. So if that's what the gang is up to, right? Doing a sort of pragmatist-oriented phenomenology of technology, then, like, what are the specific ideas? I think that the main notion the sort of keystone notion coming out of post-phenomenology is this idea of technological mediation, right? Ihde is building straight off of the phenomenology of technology and saying something like, all right, well, what does it mean to experience a technology? What's going on here? Is it like experiencing the other things that we experience? No, there's something else going on. When I say, in an example that we'll use sort of over and over in an exhausting way, when I use my glasses, we would say, oh, what am I doing? Well, I'm looking at the room, I'm looking at this table, I'm looking at you folks, I'm looking at the back wall, right? We wouldn't say I'm also, in addition to that, looking at my glasses in that list of things I'm perceiving. The glasses are somehow a mediator that's transforming how it is that we perceive, right? It's somehow coming between me and the world, transforming my abilities, and we could try to draw out what the transformations are. It transforms the world for me. It's a different world than I encounter. It transforms me in the process, right, as a glasses wearer, right? So somehow we want to capture all of that stuff, and there's a bunch of ideas for it, and I'm going to show you some of them, and I'm going to show you how useful they can be. I want to show you some of the cutting edge versions of it, and also some of the tensions, right? Like, to do even what I just listed contradicts itself a bit, right? All the things that technological mediation is doing at the same time, to try to account for them at once, there's some trouble we could run into there. If I were to recommend one of Don's books, it would probably be this one from 1990, Technology in the Life World. Although I also think that Postphenomenology and Technoscience from 2009 and Husserl's Missing Technologies from 2014 or 2016 are really good ones too if you're interested in the stuff that I'm talking about today. But this is the essential one. If you don't have this one on your shelf, then you didn't get the one that you should start with. So for building off of this stuff, there's three main ideas I want to talk about today. There's Ihde's quartet of human technology relations. For some of you, that will be like the most introductory stuff ever, but I'll talk about how people are expanding on that. I want to talk about this notion of the co-constitution of users in the world, right? This is the sort of post-human stuff I was alluding to, this how the world and how we are shaped by technological mediation. That's one of the, I think, really cutting edge places where people are building off of stuff. And this notion of multi-stability. If any of the terms in Ihde's corpus were to give the notion of mediation a run for its money in terms of being the cornerstone term, it might be this multi-stability term. And it is certainly my favorite, the thing I build off of the most. Questions? Or I'll start going through these. So let's start with this first one. So what Ihde does, this might be his most influential work. It's stuff I see the most, right? He says, all right, let's take a bunch of ideas from the history of phenomenology, see where phenomenologists have talked about technologies, take those ideas and turn them into a set of relationships that people have with technologies. And this has been really useful for people doing philosophy of technology, but also people outside of philosophy of technology. You have social scientists really take these things up a lot. It's been very influential in like HCI, computer interface design kind of stuff. So he says, here's one main way, right? Building straight off of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, he says, one type of relationship we have are embodiment relations, right? Sometimes the type of human technology relationship we have is one in which our bodily space, our perceptual capacities, the way that we interact with the world is transformed by the technology. It sort of extends and transforms us, right? So we use a hammer, and the hammer enables us to do different things. I wear the glasses, and the glasses enable me to perceive differently. And it's almost like they become an extension of my body in a way. And that's one of the main relationships that we have. Ihde says, in the history of phenomenology, it's like kind of the main example that phenomenologists talk about are these embodied examples. But one of the things that he's wanted to do through his career, and one of the things that post-phenomenologists continue to try to do, is explore the sort of multiplicity and complexity of our relationships, right? He says like, okay, but this isn't like the only one. Let's spell out the different ways that we encounter the world through technology. Oh, here's a typewriting example that we could come back to, right? Drawing straight from Merleau-Ponty to talk about the embodiment of typing. He says, the next one we'll call is hermeneutic relations, right? Taking this notion from the history of philosophy, right? Hermeneutics, I know I've met a bunch of you earlier actually in some classes I visited. Let me introduce some of these. So the term hermeneutics means something like the philosophy of interpretation and language translation, a sort of a philosophy of meaning, has this rich history of what it means for one language to be translated into another. It dates back even to philosophical questions from like the Middle Ages, where people were translating the Bible and were wondering like, what if I get this wrong, right? Like, what if I translate the Bible from one language to another and don't get the meaning translated correct? There's not like a one-to-one word for every word, right? So like, what happens when this meaning shifts? Am I committing a sin? Well, and then this from in part that there grew this rich tradition trying to figure out like, well, what is the nature of meaning? Ihde uses this term, pulls it from philosophy, and says, oh yeah, actually, and that's one of our relationships with technology, is one where we encounter the device itself, not as something that we embody, but something that we perceive directly, like as the terminus of our experience, right? We look at the thermometer and from that learn something about what's happening in our own bodies, right? We get a signal from the traffic signal. There's neat work to do here in terms of perceptual gestalts that comes from the history of phenomenology, right? Like when we look at something and perceive the meaning all at once. When we're driving and the red light comes on or the brake lights come on in front of us, how does that meaning gestalt and how is that part of our world? How does all of that happen when we have to interpret it in a slow technical way where we're like, all right, wait, lights on the back of that car, I know that that's important. What does it, no, like jumps out at us the meaning, like, oh, the car in front of us is stopping, I have to do something as well. We can talk about our relationships with technology in those terms, and that's been really useful for people to have a language around this develop. Ihde also talks about alterity relations. When alterity relations is something like when we encounter the technology as having its own kind of presence, right, that we have to deal with, right? So it's not just that we're reading and interpreting a read-off, a screen or something like that, but actually that we're interacting with the device like we would, say, typing into an automatic teller machine, an ATM, and saying like, it asks us questions almost like it's we don't think it's a person, but it's asking us like, do you want this in denominations of 10s or 20s? And we say yes. Like that's the interface takes on that kind of a shape. Sometimes we wrestle with the technologies as if they have a kind of presence. And the last one he talks about is background relations, right? To wrap out the four. These are technologies that we're using but are not experiencing directly, but experience, he says, as kind of off to the side, right? These are technologies that are shaping and changing our experience, but they're also, we're not directly interacting with them with our bodies or something like that. If that air conditioner that's in the window right there was on, then it would be shaping our experience in this room in a particular way, right? We would be interacting with it, but we wouldn't be directly using it as a kind of background way. Now, it was never the point to say, and that's it, we did it. 4, it's only 4. The point has always been like, all right, well, there's a kind of richness to this, and how can we explain it more? And there's been work on this, a lot of work. As you can imagine, people are like trying to add different relations in different ways. I've seen at least 2 attempts to talk about a distinctive writing relation in very recent papers, one by Gelly Wellner and one by Inger Berlings-Hyams, Danish woman doing architecture stuff. But the most influential set comes from this guy, Peter Paul Verbeek. Verbeek is like a famous guy in his own right at this point. So I work at Georgia Tech, and Verbeek does philosophy of design, and sometimes people will be like, hey, what type of work do you do? I'm like, oh, I do postphenomenology. Like, haven't heard of that. It's like, I do philosophy of technology. Okay, well, what kind? It's like, have you heard of Peter Paul Verbeek? Yes, I teach his book. It's like, I do Peter Paul's type of work. Meaning, like, I have to go to my friend Peter Paul and be like, you know where I work? I explain what I do where I work in terms of you, which is, he finds cute. And so we are buddies, and he is now an influential guy, does neat stuff. If there is another reason besides, say, the group of us doing a bunch of work, organizing, and Don Ihde being a super famous, influential philosopher, if there's an additional reason that postphenomenology is starting to take hold these days, it's because Peter Paul himself has also become a pretty big figure in our field. Anyway, he has also expanded on this stuff. He sometimes talks about cyborg relations. I like to think of this as sort of expanding on both ends. In his different works, he's used different terms for these, but my favorite ones are these fusion and immersion relations, right? Fusion relation would be one in which we're using a technology in a way that actually complicates even the notion of the user, like an implanted technology, right? Like a mechanical eyeball or something like that, where it's like, well, are you using it or is it just you? And then an immersion relation is a background relationship that's more active, right? That's like, that maybe you are actively using or that is actively adapting to your presence in different ways, like smart home technologies might be the go-to example here. I like these. I don't think that they finish the story, right? In fact, I think that Verbeek has done a great job of like putting his finger on a really important topic. I think that these ideas are not entirely captured by the quartet, but at the same time, I don't think that these notions, I think there's a lot of work to do to sort these things out further, right? I'm not sure that, say, a heart stent isn't at sometimes better thought of as a background relationship than as a cyborg relationship or something like that. I think that's what we have to, that type of thing we should think about. Like, what does that mean? I think there's plenty of work to do in these terms. My own contribution in this direction has been in terms of this idea, this technologically mediated field of awareness. Something that I've been trying to do is follow up further on the description of what it means to use a technology and have our experience changed. So if we take the example of wearing glasses again, right? There's this great Heidegger quote where he says, "The painting on the other side of the wall is sometimes closer to me than the glasses on my face, phenomenologically speaking, maybe not in terms of objective distance, but there's a way that it's more present than the glasses that I'm totally accustomed to." I mean, I don't think he's the accustomed language exactly. Ihde uses them as well, right? My glasses become a part of the way I ordinarily experience my surroundings. They withdraw and are barely noticed, if at all. Withdrawal is a Heidegger word. And Ihde has used the term transparency to describe this, right? He said, like, all right, we can talk about technologies that we embody as more or less transparent. And I think this is super useful, right? And I think it's one further way to go, right? Is to describe what it means to be doing this, to talk about embodiment and hermeneutic relations and such in terms of having more or less transparency. So I like to think of these as kind of variables of those relations. Now, Ihde doesn't exactly cast them that way, and it's something I've been kind of pushing. And it can like set us up to think of further variables, right? We could talk about the opposite of something that's transparent and instead something that it sort of jumps to the foreground of our awareness within our technologically mediated space. You can imagine someone's using, if I had like a laser point and we're like shooting it around, like the end of, not the laser point in my hand, but where the laser is might be the thing that, you know, is commanding some presence for you and is being sort of explicitly present. We could think about that. Annette Fors is ethnographer of technology who's done some neat work and on studying these microscopists who are analyzing pap smears, right? Samples, trying to look for, trying to do work related to cancer diagnosis, right? And she did this ethnographic field work informed by postphenomenology, and there's some really neat lines that she's found, statements from these microscope users, all women in this laboratory for whatever reason. And she says, look, there's this way that, basically the way the process works is you actually use your fingers to slide the slide, and you're looking for this pattern change, right? It's this sort of thing that you learn. You have this like array of cells that you're looking at in the sample, and sometimes the pattern will shift in this way that you see like an abnormality. There's not like a specific definition of an abnormality, but you know it when you see it. And she says like, yeah, and in their description they'll explain this as like jumping out at them, right? And I think that that's a thing that we need to talk about as well. I mean, I think they're using traditional microscopes in this case, and like we could talk about the transparency of maybe the focusing knobs in that moment, and actually something jumping forward, you know, they poppar up in Swedish. I like to talk about the composition of the field, the organization of the field, borrowing some of this language from a phenomenologist, Aaron Gurwitch. But we could talk about the organization of your field of awareness. How does usage of technology sometimes reorganize what's in front of you? I like the example of binoculars, right? If you're using binoculars, there's this pretty radical reorganization of your spatial awareness, right? Where you are visually is different from where you are, where your, say, space of hearing is in that moment, right? It's just a change in the organization of how your experience is happening. We could talk about that in terms of immersion, for example, right? From Fors again, she talks about this moment when someone finds a set of abnormal cells. They've described it as like, it's like everything else is gone, right? It's like this is fully, is in front of me. It's the only thing I'm thinking about. It's the only thing I'm seeing. we could talk about a sort of organization of awareness that way. I've got one more. Pulling from the history of phenomenology, I've been trying to push this notion of sedimentation into the phenomenology of technology, philosophy of technology conversations, which is like, how deep are our habits with our technologies, right? When we're prepared to see things in a particular way because that's how we've seen them before, right? Our pre-perceptual awareness that we develop over time. Well, how strong is that, right? I think that it can be different levels of strength depending on how deep our level of a customization is with different technologies, and that can be a useful thing to talk about. If that's the framework, then how have I been using it? There's Merleau-Ponty talking about sedimentation. Let's keep going. I've been talking about driver distraction. Driver distraction is one of my main target areas of research, and I'll be happy to come back to it. But in brief, the move has been, I've been in conversation with these cognitive scientists. There's a stack of cognitive science research that says we're really bad at driving when we're using the phone, right? When we're talking on the phone, when we're texting. And there's not a ton of theory in that empirical work. But when reading through it, something that jumped out at me as a phenomenologist is that sometimes they'll talk about their work, right? Which is like, the empirical work involves people in like driving simulations or on test tracks or something like that. They'll say, here's what we observed. We observed that, these drivers just don't have the cognitive resources to do these two demanding tasks, driving and talking on the phone at the same time. And that might be exactly true. I mean, that might be right, but it's not what they observed, right? That might be the right way, that might be what's happening. But what they observed is people missing exits, or their braking distances shortening and things like that. It's behavioral data that they're gathering in these studies. So it was like, oh, okay, maybe I could develop an alternative theory, one that builds off of postphenomenology to talk about this stuff. And I go into the embodiment of phones, a field composition where we get immersed in talking to someone on the other end of the phone, right? Where we're really focused on the conversation. If you were in a room by yourself talking on the phone, it would be really immersive, right? Or it could be if it's a good conversation or funny or you're arguing with someone or something like that. And I think that when you talk on the phone, you develop habits in those terms, right? That you put the phone up to your head and there's some habitual pull toward that kind of organization of awareness. So the thing I've been arguing is that we bring those habits into the car. Like maybe that's another way to describe why we're so bad at driving when we're on the phone. I'd be happy to talk more about that, but I have a couple other things I want to talk about. I've been doing public work on this, I've been doing this for a long time. In fact, I have a whole book on it coming out in a year. So that's the first of the three things I want to cover. They won't be all quite as long. Here's the next one. In postphenomenology, we talk about the co-constitution of the users in the world. Here's Ihde. Oh, here's Postphenomenology and Technoscience, another book I was name checking. He says, in both pragmatism and phenomenology, one can discern what could be called an interrelational ontology. By this I mean that the human experiencer is to be found ontologically related to an environmental world, but the interrelation is such that both are transformed within this relationality, right? Something like when we're using technologies, when technologies mediate our experience, we experience a changed world, and we are also changed, right? We can only understand all of these actors, right? We can only understand the world, we can only understand ourselves in terms of these relations, right? He thinks that's coming out of both phenomenology and pragmatism. Peter Paul Verbeek has run with this. This has been one of the main parts of his work, and I would say the most central building block of his own work here, right? He says, human-world relationships should not be seen as relations between pre-existing subjects who perceive and act upon pre-existing worlds of objects. Donna Haraway similarly says, beings do not pre-exist their relatings. The world is not in motion, right? What are they saying? Something like, all right, if we want to understand users, if we want to understand the world, then we have to understand how these things are reshaped through technological mediation. There's a link here to what is sometimes called posthumanism, not to be confused with transhumanism, the sort of utopians who want to change our bodies into robots and download our minds. Not that gang. I'm talking about like feminist new materialism and posthumanism kind of stuff. Karen Barad, Jane Bennett, and Rosie Braidotti, Donna Haraway, right? There's been a sort of fellow traveler status between postphenomenology and that gang, I think, for years. And Peter Paul has been drawing it to the forefront, saying like, yeah, this is one of the main things that we should be talking about. And in his work, right, Moralizing Technology is the name of the book. He's really been trying to talk about how moral discussions, moral decision making is mediated by technology, how the decisions that we have to make are reshaped by the technologies that we use. We were joking ahead of time that I was going to challenge myself not to use his main example, so I'm going to stick to that. Here's one out of my work. I've talked about computer simulated frog dissection. It's actually something I advocate for. We can go into that later, but in the United States and Canada, frog dissection in grade school is a normal thing. In like high school and middle school, it's absolutely normal. It's one of the, it's a common practice. I think it's something like upwards of 90% of students in the US say that they did it during high school. I did, and I'm a critic of it, and I think we could talk about how this practice is itself, has set up certain moral situations, right? One of the moral decisions and one of the policy decisions that come up around it are policies about whether or not you can opt out, whether you can be a sort of moral objector to it, and whether your school has to provide you an alternative assignment, right? And I think in Verbeek terms, he would say something like, yeah, this moral decision, right? Whether or not you want to do this practice in school, whether or not you want to opt out in terms of a sort of moral objection, is one that's set up by these practices, right? That by these technologies set this up to make this decision either way, right? You're not innocent in these things in either decision, right? Because of this framework that's already been set up. The world is set up for you in a certain way, and you are set up as a certain moral actor in these terms. So people have been running with this. Oya Kudina, for example, is actually getting a lot of traction lately, and she's been talking about the way that she uses the term lemniscate, which is like a figure eight turned on its side, like an infinity symbol kind of thing. And she's been trying to talk about the co-constitution of users in the world through technology, and sort of describing the processes by which that happens. And that's one way that this stuff has been expanded. Sabrina Hauser, in a paper co-authored with Peter Paul, right, has another version of this. So this is like work that I'm just trying to introduce another sort of cutting edge of this. Like, if you're interested in this, there's some work going on where people are trying to figure out, like, yeah, okay, it's one thing to say that we're co-constituted, but how? Like, what are the different moments in that co-constitution? Maybe we can spell them out. And then, and this I think will be maybe a theme for much of what's left, this stuff has been moving in a political direction as well. And I think this is one of the places where it is actually growing quite differently than what Ihde's corpuses look like. Verbeek recently has been saying, right, we need to talk about political decision-making, not just moral decision-making, but political decision-making in terms of the co-constitution of technology. And there's some studies, some articles out there that have some examples of how this can work. But in the interest of moving along, I'd like to move to this notion of multi-stability, and that's one of my, expanding on multi-stability has been one of my things I've been doing in my career. So what is this term? For me, in my view, in the field of philosophy of technology, one of the central questions has got to be something like, how can we understand technology in a way that has it both influencing us, maybe even sometimes controlling us, and yet at the same time allows for us to be using it for what we want, right? It seems like there's there are, one of the ways that the field is sometimes summarized is in terms of, on the one hand, these instrumentalists who think, oh, technology is an innocent instrument, we do what we want with it, right? Guns don't kill people, people kill people, the gun isn't a factor in that influencing at all, some sort of instrumentalism. And then on the other side, a kind of determinism, right? Technologies control us. Things are getting worse and worse in its technology. Maybe our only option is to abandon modern technology or something like that. Or things are getting better and better, and all we have to do is keep embracing technology, right? It depends on which side you are. In any case, sometimes the way this will be summed up is, yeah, neither of those views are held by many philosophers today, right? Like, the idea is to somehow be neither of those, right? You don't want to see technology as somehow merely an instrument. What kind of philosophy are you doing then, even? Philosophy is nothing, technology is nothing, the end of my philosophy. But then to be a determinist is also sort of seen as naive, right? Like, it's always bad or something like that, or it's always good. How can we somehow be both? And I think multi-stability is one of the ways that we could see it in a lot of actually what we've talked about so far, right? The nuances of co-constitution, the different possibilities for human-technology relations. With the notion of multi-stability, the idea is something like, yeah, technologies can always be used for different things. Technologies can always mean different things in different contexts, or mean different things to different people. They can always develop along different lines. And yet at the same time, they can't just be anything, right? There's only going to be some stabilities, right? There's only going to be some stable human technology. Technology is not a non-factor in that. Technology is somehow, there's always going to be multiple stabilities, but not just infinite stabilities in the way that the technology is not one of the players in those determinations. So I thought, like, yeah, no, this is one of the big things. Right, you could use the hammer to kill people is one of the ways that it comes up in Don's work often. You could hit somebody with a hammer. That would be a different kind of swing, right? Like, it would be a different relationship to the hammer than what it was designed for. That's actually also part of this, right? That, like, what a technology is doesn't reduce to designers' intentions. One of the ways that I've been working on this is through examples of scientific imaging. And in fact, in my dissertation here at Stony Brook, while it was actually a philosophy of science dissertation, Don was the advisor, I was doing like Lakatosh and Kuhn stuff, I had this long case study about neuroscientific imaging, and then also developed it in these postphenomenological ways. The different ways that images can be interpreted by scientists or medical professionals, right? If you can imagine two doctors looking at the same MRI image and debating over its implications for someone's medical diagnosis or something like that. I won't go into this too long for the sake of time, but just so you know, this is a picture of a side view of the cell wall of a neuron where it meets the synapse, right? So there was this debate in the 70s over how neurotransmission happens. How does neurotransmitter get from inside of a neuron and outside into the synapse between neurons, right? Do like selective gates open up and it sprays out? Like, how does that work? It turns out the answer are these spheres here. There are these things called spherical vesicles. This is the inside of the neuron here, and this is the cell wall here, and they're going down. The neurotransmitter is stored in these spherical organelles that then fuse to the wall, right? When they fuse to the wall, it opens up to the other side and the neurotransmitter comes out. That's how neurotransmission happens. It happens so fast, and not only is it super, super small, right? That's a way we have to mediate this phenomenon in order to see it, right? We need like electron microscopes. But it happens super fast. That was really the problem, right? We needed a temporal correlation between the stimulus and this phenomenon in order to see it. So the scientists invented this thing called the slam freezer that there's these like magnets and this like hyper cooled block, and it slams it and freezes it. You can like pick which microsecond you want to study. So you get these spheres caught in the act here in the wall, fused to it. But that's not the end of the story, because then this debate, which is not over, like 40 years later, starts. Well, what's going to happen next, though, with that little sphere? Is it about to flatten out into the membrane and pop off again somewhere else, or is it gonna stay intact and break off again, pinch and break off and go back up and get refilled? Well, we can't fast forward and see. We froze that thing, like sample's not there anymore. We froze it and stained it with metal and cut it up. So it's a debate that still exists, that they're debating. They have a lot of like extra data that they bring to this debate now, but it's based around these kinds of images. Oh, here, take a look at this. This is from one of their websites. Like, these are the two different main theories of what's happening in this picture below, right? And you can see even this demonstration was made by one of the two sides, the one who thinks they mostly break and pinch off again, because that's what it's mostly doing. And then occasionally they flatten out and a new one pops off somewhere else. That's the debate that's happening here. So I like to talk about these. You can imagine I've developed a whole philosophical architecture for this, but like talk about these images as multi-stable, and then the different sort of interpretive frameworks that we bring to them to interpret them in these different ways. I have examples from pictures from Mars. I won't go into them too much here, although this particular one is neat, because what they're debating about is this streak here that wasn't in this previous image. So it's like, well, wait, what the hell, where's this one from? Did water flow on Mars's surface in like the last 10 years? Is what they're debating, or is that, and then there's different debates about, different positions in the debate. No, that was a flow of ice-covered rocks or something like that. It's here's Catherine Haase doing multi-stability on this hyper-studied object, actually. Who's heard of Pero, the seal robot? Okay, you will now, because at first it was like, oh, this is neat that she would do this, and then it turns out like half of the major figures doing this kind of feminist work for whatever reason have studied this particular robot. Lucy Suchman, and it doesn't matter, a bunch of people, you'll see it now. This is a robot seal, and it's actually used sometimes in elder care, right? Because if someone's super elderly, having an animal can be really helpful, right? Something you take care of and that loves you, but you can imagine someone getting so infirm that they actually can't take care of an animal anymore. And these sort of robots can be useful for that sometimes for some people. So Haase is an anthropologist of science and of cultural learning. And she did this study where she uses multi-stability to talk about the seals, but she talks about their use in Danish nursing homes and in Japanese nursing homes. And the Japanese are super into them and they work, and the Danes are like, why? Why would you hand me this stupid robot? They're just not into it, and they're dismissive of it. She talks about the different sort of cultural situation of this robot and uses multi-stability to talk about it that way. And this brings me to my current work, right? This is the stuff I've been working on, the politics of public spaces, and in particular, the critique of anti-homeless design. This is where my work is these days. I mean, I'm still doing the other things I've been talking about as well, but this might be the main thrust of my stuff. I've been talking about public space objects as multi-stable. So a bench is something you can sit on and then you can sleep on. And then I've been bringing together some other theories to connect up with postphenomenology, such as actor network theory, critical theory, and feminist epistemology. And if you have questions about those, I can get to them. But to talk about, right, now these dividers are added to this bench so that you can't sleep on it, right? Cutting off one of those stabilities is the framework that I've been developing, and we can go through that. But I've been talking about like shutting down stabilities and opening up stabilities through different social inscriptions, building off of Madeline Akridge and Bruno Latour and people like that. And I've done a lot of work on this. So there I've been collecting pictures from around the world. This one's in Paris. We could talk about lots of different examples, not just benches, although benches have been my sort of, the one I've sort of theorized this stuff through the most, but we could talk about spikes on ledges. This one's from Amsterdam. We could talk about trash can lids that deter you from reaching down inside to get, say, food or to get recyclable material that you could get money for. We could talk about the larger situation. We could talk about how these devices and the patterns of these devices across public space work in concert with anti-homeless laws, right? This is the type of stuff that I try to draw out in my work. Right, so this is the type of nonsense that I've been publishing. Multi-stability and the agency of mundane artifacts, and talking about benches. This is my little book on this stuff. You can read it for free online. It's called Callous Objects. And I've been writing publicly about this stuff, right? The move has been, like, once I really got moving with this, and I sort of learned some of these skills from my driver distraction work, but like once I realized, like, oh, there's a public edge to this, I should be doing advocacy work. One of the thing about this kind of anti-homeless design I have found is that, you know, of course the design itself is not actually even the most important stuff, right? Like, if we took all of the armrests off of all of the benches, we wouldn't be like, there, we did it, homelessness is fixed, right? Like, of course not. But somehow drawing people's attention to these specific examples, which will outrage some people, in part because we're surrounded by them, but not everybody knows that, can do some work. I found it to be useful in terms of consciousness raising, right? You can start talking about anti-homeless laws, you can talk about services, you can talk about housing discrimination, things like that. This term hostile architecture is something that I've sort of stumbled on through this work. It's actually become more popular during the time I've been studying this stuff. I do name drop it early in Callous Objects, but actually when I was writing that book, it was like one of the last sentences I added because I was doing the stuff on like criticizing anti-homeless design, and this was like beginning to get more and more popular as an online term of criticism, and it's the direction I've been going, is to try to, it's one way I've been trying to extend this work further, is talk about, or let's develop an academic theory of hostile design, start going through the different examples. We could talk about discriminatory, we could go through a bunch of examples here, our skate stoppers to stop people from skateboarding. Actually, I've written a lot about fire hydrants, and we could talk about fire hydrants for a long time if you wanted. I think I'm the only person to have written humanities piece on fire hydrants. There's a lot to say about how they're locked down in different ways and for what reasons. It's actually pretty complicated and fraught. I don't mean to say it's simple and that they're all always bad. It's actually not what I'm trying to say about any of these objects, but like, but there's some important stuff to talk about here, both in terms of like the industry of fire hydrant locks, but also in terms of like heat wave relief in cities. And lastly, like the most cutting edge of this stuff, and I kind of want to throw this out there in part because I'd love to get your thoughts on, I'd love to get your thoughts on all this, but this is like the newest things I'm tooling around with. So I've been making these connections to feminist epistemology, and I've been trying to follow that out further, right? One of the things that I want to talk about is the way that feminist epistemologist, Harding is really my, what's the word? The person I'm following the most here, leading light in this, but I'm also thinking of, the whole pantheon of people doing standpoint epistemology, including Haraway and Smith, and Hill Collins, and people like that. But the move is to say something like, look, we are bodies in the world, and we are situated as knowers, right? Our personal experience limits what we can know, and sort of the groups that we're a part of and that we live and grow up through limits what we can know. And there's power relations to that, right? There's advantage and disadvantage to these things, and marginalized groups have different vantage points on things than, say, a dominant group in society. And in fact, marginalized groups can even have a vantage point on that dominance sometimes. So there's a whole sort of architecture here for like how those knowledge things work together. And there's some feminist phenomenology on this stuff. Ahmed is a good go-to person here. Weiss is also someone I'm drawing on, Linda Alcoff. But the idea is something like, all right, so what gets backgrounded, right? Go back to the stuff toward the beginning. What gets transparent in our experience, right? What things instead jump out? Like within our technological experience, I like to be talking about the politics of that, right? How does our situatedness of knowers relate both to the philosophy of technology, but then also to our perceptual habituation, right? How does that I want to take it from from epistemology and go further into how that epistemology becomes sedimented within our perception, right? So it's not just limits on what we know, but then also limits on what we see based on those limitations in our knowledge getting sedimented within our sort of perceptual frameworks. And that's a direction I would like to go. I've written a little bit about this already, but it's one of the main places I've been trying to drag this stuff. All right, thank you for sitting through that.
Thank you very much, Robert. As some of you know, Don's been hospitalized, but he is recovering slowly. But thanks to the technological transparency, he has actually been watching.
Yeah.
So, hello, Don. We miss you.
Yeah.
So, do we have questions for Robert?
Hey, well, thank you for the talk. So, I'd like to hear a bit about your public work,
okay.
And in particular, you're at Georgia Tech. I was wondering if you've ever had a role in design of technologies, and if so, what do the collaborations look like between you and engineers and designers? And you talked a bit about your public work, but what is the role of a philosopher in say discussions about policy and what's your experience with that?
Yeah, no, I like that. Thank you for that question. So, I haven't worked much with engineers in terms of design, teach engineers, right? So I bring some of these things into my sort of professional ethics courses. At University of Twente, Peter Paul has a design lab where he's been sort of systematically working with the engineers. That's another engineering school, maybe not a coincidence, where they have been collaborating on projects. And actually, this is another place where I think Peter Paul's work comes sort of straight out of Don's. There's places where Don has been a sort of early advocate for getting philosophical and ethical work into the design phase rather than the sort of, doing ethics afterward. Like, oh, it's out there, and then let's do an ethical assessment of the technology that exists. Like, okay, well then what would it mean to get those ideas and maybe even some people into the early work, and Peter Paul's really made a career out of that. I haven't been working with designers. I mean, I have been working with cognitive scientists, especially in terms of the driver distraction stuff. The way that I've actually been pleased with how that's gone. Right, the first time you talk to a department of cognitive scientists bringing in phenomenology, you think like, uh-oh, am I walking into like a Shark Tank, or are they just going to look at me like I've got two heads? Oh, that was unfounded. They were super interested in it and open to, not interested like, oh, I'm going to start using phenomenology in my own articles, but like very much like, oh, this is a neat way to think of our own work, and I've stayed in touch, and it's it's helpful to have those experts to make sure that I'm getting the science right in my own work. So then the advocacy stuff that I've been doing, then if it's not like working directly with designers, and how has it gone? It wasn't the original goal, but now I've found myself doing. In fact, let me tell the story like this. I mean, right, this is, I guess, a alumni like career retrospective kind of thing. So like I've always been interested in interdisciplinary stuff, right? Stony Brook was a great fit because of that, right? One of our papers that we had to do as part of, being a graduate student is like, was it called the interface paper, right? Like one of them is an interdisciplinary paper, right? This department was such a good fit for me that way. Working with Don Ihde was such a good fit for me that way. I mean, I had a psychologist on my dissertation committee. So having that sort of interdisciplinary flavor and having that sort of pragmatic commitments as a kind of intuition is a place Ihde and I had always connected, right? Like, I didn't need to be convinced about pragmatism and phenomenology. That was just sort of a place I already was, right? So that's where I started. It still wasn't the case that I thought like, and boy, am I gonna have a career doing advocacy work. I'm gonna like be writing magazine articles or talking on the radio about this stuff. I never thought that. Actually, you can see in some of these examples that I gave today, sort of the arc of these things. I didn't quite tell them in order. I started off I wanted to do STS looking papers, right? Like Don, I wanted to do, all right, like here's some imaging things. I'm gonna want it to be interdisciplinary, I want to talk to scientists, I want to prove my STS cred and do some, right, like have a real laboratory looking, well, as a philosopher of technology, the field is small and you need to overlap with STS and have places to publish. And I like that stuff. And I wanted to, have laboratory study looking things. And, talking to friends and family, they're like, slam freezer, neat. Then I started working on, and I haven't stopped working on that stuff, but then I also started working on the driver distraction stuff. And then suddenly friends and family were like, oh, I have opinions about that, tell me more. They wanted to hear all about it and wanted to talk about it. And then suddenly, like, I would be giving talks and the whole room would have things to say about this stuff. And it was like, oh, this is different, right? This is like a technology that somehow gets into people's lives, right? People use the phone while driving, or they have phones and they drive, and they have things to say about this stuff. They have ideas about it, and it's like, oh, maybe I could like change people's thinking on this. I still thought of the project at the beginning just as I thought, in my head, I was like, I'm being ambitiously interdisciplinary, right? Like I'm gonna write for cognitive scientists to, like I'm hoping they will also appreciate this, or at the very least, think that I'm taking them seriously. By doing that application work, a lot of the ideas I was presenting today, I learned through the application, right? Like you're doing this interdisciplinary work, here are these phenomenology ideas, oh, they don't fit exactly right. And at first it's like, oh, that stinks. And it's like, no, that doesn't stink. That's an opportunity, right? Now I'm tweaking the ideas, and I've got my own version that I can bring back to the post-phenomenologists, this growing crowd. They're like, oh, that's neat. I can now make my things fit better using Rosenberger's version of this stuff. Interdisciplinary work. But then as it kept going, especially with that project, I realized like, oh, actually, here's what I'm doing. Like my audience might actually be the public rather than merely the scientists, right? Like what I'm doing here is finding other ways to talk about this phenomenon. The more I got into it, the more important I realized it was. I got invested, right? I was convinced by the scientists by their data. I learned about the sort of advocacy they're doing. I'm like, oh, I can do this in a different way. I'm talking in a different way about this stuff by trying to do phenomenology in a way that the cognitive scientists will, I don't mean understand like that they couldn't understand phenomenology, but more like that they would be willing to listen to because they're busy, right? I was coming up with versions of this stuff that I could just talk to a wider interdisciplinary crowd, and I started turning that into a form of advocacy, right? Like trying to raise awareness of issues of driver distraction. So then when I come across, so the homelessness stuff has been long gestating, right? I was here as a graduate student, and my spouse, also a graduate student here, and her book is in the main office there I saw, that she co-edited with Marion Rawlinson and Serene Potter. We're standing there in New York City, and she says, hey, look, that bench, you know why those armrests are there? And I was like, no. And she explained it to me. She grew up in New York City. I had no idea. And I was like, it was like, as a philosopher of technology, she was like, I know you would like that. But here's the thing, I didn't immediately like go home and write a paper. Like I just sort of was thinking about it for a while. I started taking pictures. I started using it in my courses, because part of my job at a place like Georgia Tech is to explain to engineers that their work requires professional judgment, right? The engineering ethics and professional ethics for engineers is trying to get them out of this sort of mindset of thinking of their job as mostly a kind of algorithm, and actually more as a kind of professional that people in society are counting on, right? And when you tell them, hey, there's a politics to technology, or the ethics to technology, they're like, no, I don't want, and not even that they think that that's wrong. It's like, no, don't even tell me that. I don't even want to know, like I wanted to get into engineering, not because like I don't care about that stuff, but like I didn't want to have to care about that in my job though, and it's like my job to say like, yeah, you have to though, you super have to, right? And I found the benches to be really helpful that way, right? I would get emails from students like years later being like, hey, I'm in this city and here's some pictures of the benches here, and then I was like, oh, this is neat. And then as I got more into it, right, like with the driver distraction, it's not that I didn't care about it before, but like I got more invested and realized like I might have something to say, right? And when that started to happen, it was like, oh, and I have these skills. Like now I know how to do this already. And so main mode of advocacy has been through public writing. It's not because I stepped back and like listed all the possible ways one could do it and said, oh, that's the best one. It was more like, what do I have available to me, and what skills can I bring to this? What opportunities can I make for myself in terms of advocacy here? That's how I've done it.
Yeah, Robert, let's make sure other students have a chance to ask questions. Juan?
Thank you for the clarity of your talk. I was wondering if there has been a contemporary answer to the following critique to postphenomenology. So it seems that the categories that are used to describe the human-technology relations are too broad. In the case of embodiment relations, two relations with technology can be confused, that one of incorporation, and as in the case of a prosthesis, and that one of extension. In the case of a prosthesis, you want, or incorporation, you want transparency to work. And in the case of extension of your body, it might be a risk that it became too transparent, as it happens with our cell phones.
I like that. Okay, so so the short answer is I don't think that there's a lot of work on that already. I would be surprised if no one's talking about it at all, because like I said, this quartet gets sort of hyperanalyzed, but not in a very systematic way where there's a conversation, everyone's responding to one another. It's more like one-offs over 3 decades, people commenting on this stuff. I'm open to your idea of like splitting different kinds of embodiment relations into those 2 types. I'm hesitant about the further part, about how like one you want and the other one could be bad or something like that. I think it's probably the case that I bet that depends on the case. I bet there will be some cases where like when you're extended, you want it to be transparent. Actually, driving might be like that, right? You're extended through this whole car, and in some ways through the whole driving experience out into like the highway and stuff like that, and you super need transparent. You need to be thinking about turning the car, not turning the wheel, right? But you're right. There's also dangers to it, right? The problems that can come with sedimentation and transparency is something that I'm really interested in, like the politics that get buried in that, the malfunctions.
Gio?
Yeah, okay, thank you so much for your talk. I love using callous objects in my class. The hostile architecture pictures click immediately with technologists and computer science. They're fantastic.
Thank you, that's so awesome.
But I guess I wanted to ask then, like along that lines, is like, what do we do now that we agree with you about hostile architecture and the social impacts of technology?
Yeah.
Verbeek talks about how kind of if you have like a very liberal understanding of policy, there's a tendency to view technology as an individual, autonomous, one-to-one encounter. And then if you take that to example like digital privacy, your framework of thinking might be like, how do I protect individuals' privacy? But my sense is that like with this discussion about multi-stability and context, the kind of policies you have in mind are gonna be very different from that. I mean, Verbeek is very critical of that, that one-to-one encounter.
Yeah, right.
So I wonder if you could elaborate the kind of political implications of this.
Yeah, no, it is super hard, right? So one of the things, you can let me know if this actually circumvents your question rather than answers it, but like one of the things I've been finding with the topic of hostile design, one of the things that's exciting about it is this phenomenon I was talking about where like my students, like undergrad students will like write to, you might not remember me, but like here's some pictures of benches, right, from I'm in another country, here's these, or I'm in my hometown and I never realized these were here kind of things, right? And it's like, that is a neat moment, and it might be politically powerful for sometimes. Sometimes people are like, yeah, now I see them now, and I love them because I'm really, not everyone's gonna be on your same side politically, and that's part of it. But like, for people who are like, I also find this outrageous, I think that there's a useful moment there for exposing sort of the larger system. right? That is, and in fact, this is the thing I was trying to say with like, right, we could take all of the armrests off of all of the benches and no one would think that that's a cure for homelessness, right? Like that's, no one would think that, no one should think that. So then what are we talking about when we're criticizing the armrests on the benches? It's like, well, no, I think the iceberg analogy is a good one there, right? Like this is the tip of the iceberg, right? This is the thing that you see and might be outraged by, and if you are, right, maybe because it was all around you and you didn't notice it before and suddenly you're like, oh geez, like there is, I can now see that there's a pattern, not just one, and then we may be able to then draw people's attention to even further things like anti-homeless laws or something, things that are targeting the same group. I think that sort of right to rest initiatives and housing first kind of things can, there are some ideas that I would advocate for, even those are fraught and complicated too, but like I think there might be some opportunity there, but it's complicated, right? Like the problem of homelessness is probably a stack of very different problems all under the same name. Is definitely one. So I don't. I know that's not what you're asking.
Robert, let me develop that question.
Okay, please.
Suppose I'm mayor of a small town.
Yeah.
We have a big homelessness problem, but we also have a problem with disabled people who really complain about not being able to find seats on the subway or for buses.
Mm-hmm.
And they are, a vocal minority, but it's important to take care of them too. So I received a grant for $100,000,
Mm-hmm.
and I wonder, what do I do with it? And I take $95,000 and build homeless shelters,
Mm-hmm.
but another $5,000, I put these things on benches so that to help people get seating who really need it.
Yeah.
Am I anti-homeless?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it certainly doesn't sound like it when you put it that way. Now here's the thing though, right? But you also could be, right? Like it's not automatically the case that mayor is not, right? If the problem is conceived, right? The problem of homelessness can also be used in two different ways, right? Sometimes it can mean the problem that people are experiencing radical poverty and need help. Sometimes it can mean, it sure is a problem that there's visible homelessness in this area, right? If the armrests are for that latter, if they're addressing that secretly, then maybe it would be. Now, if the armrests are exactly for what you're talking about, right? Like, you talk to disability advocates and they're quick to point out that, like, no, actually, if you're following the ADA, you don't need to put armrests all across the whole bench in order to do that, right? Like, one big one at the end is actually the thing that we need. But I can take the spirit of your question. Like, what if though? It seems like totally, yes, that could be okay. And an example I like as well, I mean, a version of that'll do is something like, you are a small business owner and you have a bench out front because you're a barber shop, and sometimes there's spillover and people want to wait outside, and like it's a real problem if someone during the day is sleeping on that bench for you. Are you anti-homeless if you put an armrest on that bench? Is that the same thing as putting armrests on all the benches across the park or something like that so people can't sleep there at night? I don't know that has to be the same thing, right? And there's a way that the small business owner can also be a victim of the larger problem of homelessness that's not being addressed by the community. But we can still criticize the bench sometimes too, right? I mean, we can. I think that we can criticize hostile design. I want to stay open to the possibility that we can criticize hostile design without having to say that we can point out the pattern. We can point out that, okay, your individual bench is still part of a pattern across the city. I mean, maybe there's no pattern across the city and there's no homelessness in the city, or people are allowed to spend time in the parks at night and it's fine, and you put an armrest on the bench and it doesn't hurt anybody. But like it could still, but if that's not the case and there's nowhere for people to go, and you're also signaling that it can also be that, and yet net be acceptable. I think that I think our criticism can be nuanced enough to include that. It is tricky though. I mean, it's a good question.
Well, what your work does is bring to light its impact, but its impact may be, you know, beneficial or not, but. Other questions? Okay, well, Joe?
Oh, there's some students here, I know we're gonna discuss, your work, later this afternoon. I'm very intrigued by the fire hydrant. You know, this is a very mundane object.
Yeah.
You know, we pass by any number of them, if you're in the city, see them all the time. In what sense is this an occasion for philosophical thinking?
Yeah.
You know, what do you do with the fire hydrant?
I mean,
Who knew?
it was, no, it's one of my favorite because with the benches now, it's gotten to the point where it's like, hey, these benches, you know what the armrests are for? Does anybody know? And the whole room's like, we know. It's like, all right. And then when I get to the hydrants, people are like, oh, we haven't heard this one yet. And again, credit where it's due. My spouse was like, hey, just one day, was like, hey, you know what? But it was like, no, I didn't. How do you know all the stuff? People don't know. People who study urban design don't notice this, right? Like, but that's what she's like. And so fire hydrant locks are an interesting thing to me. It's a super complicated example, right? Because it is, you know, it is a genuinely dangerous thing if the water pressure is low because people have all their a bunch of hydrants open, right? It is a dangerous thing if someone gets pushed out into the street by the amount of water that comes out of a fire hydrant is a lot, right? Like way too much. However, but heat waves in cities are also a problem, right? And especially in poor neighborhoods. A colleague of mine, I was using this example earlier today, she grew up in East New York and said like, yeah, it was like the 70s and the fire department would come and just open all the hydrants for us, right? Like that was like, we didn't open them, like they opened them for us because it was hot and there's not like public pools, it's not air conditioning. So it's a complicated example. And I like how mundane it is, right? It's the mundane aspect of it that actually I wish I thought of this ahead of time, right? I wish I was so clever that I was like, mundane examples aren't gonna be the best, but instead it was more like, I kind of learned through experience. And now I wanna tell people, especially grad students, because it's like, oh, find this, especially if you're a phenomenologist, because these examples cut into people's everyday lives, and now they notice them and think about them, and it can be, you can do some useful work there. Not the only way to do useful phenomenological work, but it is one way. And fire hydrants are one of these. There's a whole industry of, the websites of these different types of fire hydrant locks are really interesting. They're super expensive. How they work is neat. How people hack them is neat. There are, I don't have this picture ready. So I saw finally in Philadelphia when I was there this time last year. I knew these things existed because I saw them on the websites of these locks, but there's plastic caps that people will get, right? Why would you get a plastic cap for a fire hydrant outlet cap? Why not the normal metal ones? Because people steal them and sell them for scrap, right? So then they make these and it actually says in both English and Spanish on these fire hydrant caps, like non-scrappable material. Fascinating to me, right? There's just these objects that are right there, everywhere all around us, doing all of these things that people are fighting over them. And the thing I care about is the heat wave relief stuff. I think is like the advocacy part, but even just in general, like these objects having all these different purposes that we could talk about other purposes too. And one more thing, that you can go in New York City. You can go to the I actually got this one from Queens. You can go to the fire department and fill out a form. You need a driver's license, and they'll loan you an outlet cap with holes drilled in it, so that you can hook it up to the hydrant and make a community sprinkler out of it. Since most of them are locked, what you do instead is call the fire department and they'll come out and put it on. It's one of the services they provide. I think it might be super awesome. It addresses a lot of the problems we were talking about, like the amount of water that comes out is a real problem. Like I used to know the number offhand. It's a ludicrous amount of water that pours out of them, right? You just don't want this. It doesn't have that problem. Maybe it's not perfect, but I think that it's cool. And I've seen them. was driving through New York City one time and saw, oh, there goes one of those things. That's neat that people are using this. Cities put a lot of money into advertising that this is a program that exists. There are, sorry, I think it might be Linda Ihde. This is a thing that you can do, and it's, is it an answer to hostile design? I don't know, actually this one might be, right? This might be an alternative way, a different sort of stability that, you know, might address some of the problems I'm concerned about.
Now, Robert,
Yeah.
time too has barriers
Yeah,
that we
yeah.
have to obey. So thank you very much. Let's
Thank you, guys.
thank Robert.
Thank you.
And those of you who want to
Thanks.
either, hi Don, those of you who want to talk with Robert further, please come up and he'll be here for another day or so you can make special arrangements. Thanks a lot, Robert.
Thank you, guys.